I've played a lot of NES games, and while playing them, I've noticed that there are some quirks with the NES, lots of tropes that carried us through playing games. But sometimes those tropes are hardwired into how the NES performs, and it's known as sprite flicker. Usually this isn't something I would consider talking about, but during our monthly Firefighter episode, a unique video was selected. Von Spider, one of our viewers, pitched the idea of talking about it, and so I will. Plain and simple. That's what I do around here. Now, talking about the top 10 NES games that have sprite flicker involves playing all of the licensed games on the NES, and that is something I don't really have the time to discuss. It's just not feasible given my strategy on Twitch and YouTube. But that being said, I do have some games that definitely stand out for having obnoxious amounts of sprite flicker. I'm not an engineer, nor am I a programmer. My knowledge of video gaming development tends to stop once my finger touches the power button, and I'm not going to pretend to know something that I don't. Other YouTubers might. I'm not going to. But what I do know is that the NES was unique about how sprites were presented. The NES could only show a certain number of sprites at any given time, and to overcome that limit, developers would have sprites turn on and off quickly. The best way to describe it is a juggler with 3 hands, but he's trying to juggle 4 balls. That's the nature of sprite flickering, the NES juggling art. Vertically, the NES didn't struggle as much, but if you had tons of sprites horizontally, you'd run into some issues. Some companies were clever with it. They understood the limitations of the NES, and they made sure that their sprite work wasn't too much of a stressor. But some companies, they didn't give a shit. Why would they? They said send it. And what resulted was a non-stop flashing buffoonery of a time. But that doesn't mean that the game was bad. Let's talk about 10 of them. Starting off our list is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3: The Manhattan Project. Now, if you were paying attention, you might recall I mentioned the limitations of the NES and how it tends to happen horizontally. This is the perfect example of that. In a beat-up situation, having sprites walking towards you is something to be expected, and I can kind of give props to Konami because if you notice, when the sprite flicker happens, it tends to be just the lower part of the body, at least when Foot Clan members are coming your way. Which to me, that means that the sprite sheet has a little bit of Konami's magic, and I appreciate that. I would assume that in a 2-player game it might be more prevalent, but my kids aren't here, and if I asked my wife to play Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 with me, she would probably just blink a few times and then walk away. It's worth checking out though. I love beat 'em ups, and this line of games has historically been fun for what it is. Cabal is a successful arcade game from a company that you might not recognize, TAD Corporation. What did they do? Cabal. Well, that's not totally true. They did about 6 games, but the only game to gain any true traction was Cabal, which is an arcade shooter where we awkwardly stand at the bottom of the screen, Thanosing anything that comes our way with the power of unlimited ammunition. But if you've played the NES version, it looks like we play as a guy wearing a spandex onesie with a hole in his ass cheek, with roller skates, firing bullets at whatever he wants, and then after you clear a stage, he goes full PCP Gorilla Ooga Booga and crab walks into the horizon. It's a very eccentric game. Now, the sprite flickering isn't as bad as other games, and it usually only happens if we take on flying enemies that spit out tons of projectiles, or if they're spread out, so you tend to see it more so in the upper quadrant of the game than you do the bottom. I love Bubble Bobble. It's a great game, always has been, and I haven't encountered a version that's upset me. Yet. I'm sure I will, but for the time being, my opinion on it hasn't been spoiled by subpar developers, and I hope to keep it that way for a little while. If you've played Bubble Bobble, you know exactly where this is going, because it's an issue with most platformers, right? We're playing as Bub and Bob, and we're blowing tons of bubbles, all the while being chased by tons of enemies, at least once the game progresses. And obviously, the NES cannot render that many sprites simultaneously, so it flickers a lot. But the good news is, even with the flicker, the game itself, it doesn't slow down that much. And when push comes to shove, I would much rather deal with flickering than a slowdown, which you will see as a chief complaint in a future game on this list. I could have put either Gradius or Life Force here, but I noticed the flickering happening a little bit more in Life Force than I did with Gradius. And to be honest, we could probably put any horizontal shooter here because if we're lobbing tons of projectiles, our ship, or whatever entity we're controlling, will flash. And based on the programming, that flash can affect projectiles, the enemies, it can turn a game into a bad game quickly, and almost all horizontal shooters do this to some capacity. The true challenge for developers was minimizing the presence of that in an environment where we need to bob and weave through projectiles, which is why many times you'll see enemies coming out in a sort of sine wave pattern. That's a unique way of fighting the flicker. What is refreshing about Life Force in particular, though, is that it isn't fully horizontal. There are alternating stages where we go from vertical to horizontal, which blew my mind. That's not something we saw very often during that era of gaming, and to my knowledge, for what it's worth, Salamander or Life Force was the first game that I noticed it in. It also happened in Abadox The Deadly Inner War as well. That being said, Life Force is a great game, and if you're into shoot 'em ups, this is one that you'll want to have in your collection. Period. Dot. Ever played Final Fight? You know the game where the mayor's daughter is kidnapped and he says, "Cowabunga it is," and rips off his shirt and walks through the whole street wearing suspenders, beating the shit out of anyone who looks like they might be a bad guy? Yeah. To put that into perspective, just for a moment, this is the equivalent of Glenn Jacobs donning his cane mask to go wrangle some dingles, right? The absurdity of that storyline brings me tremendous joy. True, unbridled, chaotic, neutral joy. Now, Final Fight was an arcade game and it was released on the Super Nintendo, but we did receive a watered-down, chibi, or super deformed version on the NES, and it was known as Mighty Final Fight. It has some strengths and it has some weaknesses. For example, on the Super Nintendo version, we couldn't play as all three characters. On the NES version, we could. We could play as Cody, Hager, and Guy. Guy himself was omitted from the Super Nintendo version, then Capcom released Final Fight Guy and brought him back, but same issue. No Cody. We experience a lot of flickering during fight scenes, the same as we did with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, but for me, it's much more noticeable. But if you can look past that, I think it's an alright game for what it is. Contra 1, wonderful game. Super C, tremendous fun. A feat of technology as well, if you ask me. Contra Force, it's about as stiff as a dog turd on a winter day. Just horrible nonsense. I'm actually curious, did anyone ever see this game and think, "Oh fuck, another Contra?" Because if so, I would love to hear about your reaction when you actually started playing it. Contra Force wasn't even supposed to be a Contra game at all. It was supposed to be known as Archound, and Konami has even gone out of their way to disown it, saying it's not part of the official timeline, which in the video game world is the equivalent of saying, "You're out of the fucking will, get out of my house." And it deserves it. It's a bad game. Not only are we dealing with sprite flicker, but we're also dealing with a tremendous amount of slowdown, which is momentum breaking, especially in a game that stems, at least spiritually, from a series where you need to quickly react to things coming your way. When I played this with my friend Nick, it was borderline unplayable. In a single player situation, it's already slow. Imagine using 2 players. It's just not a good time. You know, for a game that you would spend roughly $300 for, you would likely expect it to run perfectly, right? No little issues, no flickering. Well, hate to break it to you, quality and price don't mean anything when it comes to the NES era of gaming. In fact, in some cases, it's inversely true. Some of the worst games on the system are expensive. It's all tied to certain metrics that affect the price. If you're curious about it, I did make a trilogy of videos that focused on impractically expensive, practically expensive, as well as Holy Grail games, so feel free to check that out if you want. Snow Bros itself, it's an arcade conversion, it's a port. The game itself is a mixture, if you will, of Bubble Bobble and Tumble Pop. We play as Nick or Tom, if we have 2 players, and our sole objective is to throw snowballs at enemies, which results in them turning into bigger snowballs. We can then kick those snowballs, and depending on how the stage is designed, that kicked snowball might take out the rest of the enemies. It offers a little bit of strategy, but the problem is, if enemies bunch up in a horizontal line, rave time. Burai Fighter is the perfect example of fuck it, send it. And you can thank KID for that. KID stands for Kindle, Imagine, and Develop. But the only thing they kindled was me imagining how much it must have sucked to try to playtest this game. KID wasn't popular as a company, at least not in America. They did release a few games you might know, such as G.I. Joe and Low G-Man, both of which were published by Taxon, which is a name I avoid like the plague if I'm able. But KID wasn't a stranger to placing far more sprites on the screen than necessary. In fact, if you dip your toes into the Famicom library, they have a fantastic shooter named Rekka, right? It was created for the Summer Carnival. It's one of the best vertical shooters on the Famicom, but because it's Famicom, I don't tend to talk about it here. Burai Fighter isn't necessarily a bad game, right? It just suffers quite often from the flickering. Not as much as other games would, but there are certain points in it where your character will be swarmed by enemies, and they tend to come in horizontally, so therein lies the problem. Oh yeah, Tecmo. Tecmo is known for seeing the sprite flicker and saying, "Whatever, they'll buy it." And guess what? We did. Tecmo Super Bowl was the greatest sports game on the NES, period. The amount of stuff that the game is capable of doing on the NES is amazing. It's dope to sit there and simulate entire seasons, to keep track of an entire 1990 to 1991 season in terms of statistics. The playbooks are better, the animations are better, the cutscenes are better. Everything is great about this game. But the one thing that always drove me insane was the amount of sprite flickering, which is kind of unavoidable because it's football. You're never going to have simply one opponent coming your way. That's fundamentally impossible to avoid if you want to represent the sport accurately on the system. And let's be honest, historically, the NES wasn't that great at pulling off football. This was the outlier. It's a solid game. Tecmo Super Bowl did all of that and more, but it will flicker most of the time. The most recent Tecmo Super Bowl game was a callback to the roots of Tecmo Bowl with Tecmo Bowl Throwback in 2010, but it doesn't look that great. If you enjoy NES gaming, you'll probably remember River City Ransom. Unless you're me. I played a ROM hack of it when I was a kid where everyone's wiener was out, and it was called Pussy City Pimps. But what did I know? I didn't get the games. My dad did. I don't think I've ever seen him get so red in the face before. But River City Ransom, it's part of the Kunio-kun franchise, and for a long time, Technos reused assets a few different ways for a few different games. It was just their jam, and honestly, they were smart about it. And what's funny is that it worked. The games were great. In Super Dodgeball, our only objective is to ping the shit out of the opposing team. No more, no less, which if you ask me, is pretty straightforward. But understand, I'm not talking about standard shpah, you know, the sound of a dodgeball hitting a kid in the face, the shpah. No. I'm talking about Boss Rutan and Mirko Cro Cop kicking you in the skull at the same time. And it's funny. It's a funny game. But the issue is because there's so much going on at any given time, you will see a lot of sprite flickering to a capacity that is kind of distracting. But that's just the way it happens, and you do get kind of used to it. Took me about, 10 to 15 minutes of playing it, and I started focusing more on the gameplay. And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of this list? Are there any games that come to mind when the topic of sprite flickering comes into play? I'd love to hear it down below, and I know the community would as well. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this video, you're already at home. We're a group of people who love remembering a time when life was a little bit easier to live. We'd love to have you here. Finally, the most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of all the videos and projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortifier out.